everybody. Here's the view from my present location. I'm at the lawn bowling fields once more. And I've been watching the sky and the living world, the people, listening to the groups of them, gathered together to share for all the myriad purposes that draw them together. And rarely are such purposes as singular as we are inclined to determine or distinguish in language. That is to say that the people come together for a layered, we don't have to pick a shape, but it could be a cone. Right? And there could be a sort of most fundamental purpose at the top of that cone, and then highly nuanced layers of purpose comprising its height or depth. And of course, the purposes for which we come together are at once general in that we can identify schemas that are shared among the participants, and they are also unique in that there's a profoundly distinctive aspect to each participant's purposive interaction with themselves and the group. And there are aspects that are relatively I might say dominant or penetrative, right? They have the desire to control or motivate the group and the participants to steer or select paths in their present or future travel together, using travel, of course, as a metaphor. And there are purposes that are receptive, right? To be enriched or transformed, to have our own goals. Corrected isn't the right word, but have the scope and depth of our awareness deepened, yeah? So that we don't just cling to a relatively narrow and perhaps disoriented beginning position. And there are purposes that are projective, right? They are expressive. And there are purposes that are reflective, right? Where we sort of orbit a perspective or topic or goal together. There are purposes that are receptive in that we want to experience something analogous to the fertilization of seeds that we've carried or nurtured. And there are also purposes that are prophylactic or prescriptive, right? We want to be prevented from a course of action that is dangerous or for which the risk is unequal to the potential for reward, or that are disoriented. So there's a corrective aspect. And it's fascinating to me. It's fundamentally fascinating to me simply to be human. I'm looking at this tree which may be dead and yet may not. You can see some fungus on the tree, but also something resembling fresh sap. Some fungus and something resembling fresh sap if I'm capturing it. And I can see sap dripping from other portions of the tree that make me suspect it's not yet what we consider dead. And of course, the nuance with which we approach identity is one of my favorite topics. How we get from everything to something, and the purposes involved in selecting the paths, the choices that take us from ambiguity to certainty, or at least, if not to certainty, to the risk, to taking the risk of declaration. So you noticed that, and I'm sure it seems entirely natural, that I declared that very sophisticated phenomenon back there that I took some video of. I declared it a tree. Right? I employed the pretense of knowing. And to do that, I had to travel from the great cloud, right, of potential ways to collapse the everything into a something. I took a specific path, a familiar path, one I was trained to take by the adults who instructed me and the peers who instructed me and the culture who enculturated me and enlanguaged me, and taught me the invisible technologies of abstraction. The methods. Now, you might see some shiny material on my face from time to time. And that material, just to be clear, is the sap of a tree that I love. And if someone were to ask me why do I place the sap on my face? My answer would have to be very incomplete and mostly unlike the truth. And the reason that would be so is that language very incompletely captures the nature of identity, purpose, experience. Our visceral inclinations are profoundly complex beyond the capacities of language to distinguish. And were we to have to completely distinguish even one such inclination, I suspect that task might be infinite, eternal. We'd have to spend the rest of time on that task and would still fail. Language is an overlay on experience. And it's one of the primordial technologies that differentiates us, that makes our kind of animal a mysteriously unique and dangerous participant in the biosphere and its histories and futures. And so for me, understanding in a deep way and being able to explore and speak about how language makes us so unique and how we use it, sometimes very clumsily, and whether or not we are subject to it, or, in other words, whether we are unconscious of how it might tend to dominate our capacities for individual and communal intelligence and perception and awareness and developmental efflorescence. And surely my concern is valid here, for it does, for most of us. Most of us, I think, many of us in any case, although there are unique exceptions in each person, but overall there's a very troubling trend for our capacities to be intelligent, for our capacities for awareness and understanding and developmental growth to be eclipsed by our habitual relationship with not just language, but categories. And one of my primary hopes and concerns is to contribute something valuable and liberating to our common and largely unconscious relationships with language and knowledge and the faculties implicit, yet mostly unseen and undeveloped, that lie within the range of our access to our own human interiority. And so this is part of the reason why you'll commonly find me reflecting on topics similar and related to this desire. For I believe that we can learn to use this primordial technology to understand our mysterious relationship with it, and perhaps even its origins in our species, in new ways. That grant us the capacity to escape its gravity in a way analogous to how the discovery of explosive technologies, explosive combustion technologies, gave our species the capacity to leave the surface of the earth and enter the vastly mysterious and infinitely complex sphere of time-space. And I find it interesting that, and though it's not my intention to highlight this, it's just interesting to me that the unimaginable violence of explosives is what carried the first human bodies into space and to the moon. And again, it's not my intention to suggest that a similar kind of violence is necessary to lift us from our long and habituated entrapment in language and conceptual thought and ordinary knowledge to a new order of relationship with those features of our uniqueness as animals. I'm not claiming that violence is required, and I'm very hopeful that we could substitute something like fascination or enchantment or wonder or awe or reverence for that propulsive power that can lift us beyond our common and very humble relationships with the technologies of language and knowledge. And I think I believe that that's attainable because it's been my own experience in my life that it was those emotions I listed that helped me in my own quest to achieve new degrees of freedom. And perhaps one of the most important elements of that process is the purposive element. Our motivations for doing so. I mean, I have many as a single human being, but I have some that don't come from me personally. I've inherited them. They belong to the world of nature. They belong to my species. They belong to the entire history of the developmental history of human consciousness. Something we might call an evolution, but I'm a little cautious of using the term evolution in place of development. I think this is a relatively common mistake. Though evolution often resembles development, it's far more complex than mere, progress, right? It's incredibly complex. And in fact, this is an idea our species has only been aware of for some, a couple of lifetimes, maybe 2 or 3, right? So I think the understandings we've attained so far, the technical understandings, however advanced they may appear, are staggeringly incomplete. This doesn't mean we should dismiss them. We should just be aware that if you've got a view on 2%, say, of a phenomenon, you've got the blind men examining the elephant problem, right? Almost certainly. Earlier, I saw a solitary robin. I mean, I've been watching, as I said, the people and the living world today, and the sky and everything. And it's fascinating to observe the transformation of pace that has come over the entirety of what I experience when I leave the box full of rectangles that is my shelter. The transformation of pace is astonishing. The behavior of animals is obeying a new fundamentally orienting, I don't have a word for this thing. Governance, governor, right? In the sense of something that governs a pulse, or a rhythm. the animals and most of their activities are slower. And because they're slower, they have like a fundamentally different character, and I suspect very different results. For example, the gophers, and I'll admit that I have no idea what's going on. I'm only relaying my perceptions, yeah? And those perceptions are colored by my purposes in looking, right? I am inclined to notice that which is, isomorphic with, like, the shape is the same, right? With my purposes and my habits and inclinations and what fascinates me, all these things. And so to some degree, I must be as blind as I am insightful. And I'm okay with that. As long as I understand it and have some opportunity to reflect upon it and thus perhaps draw new features of my humanity and my organismal aspect and my cognitive, relational, all the aspects of my life, right? As long as I have the chance to draw new features into my awareness and into play. I saw this robin. I mean, the gophers are making holes that are totally different from anything I've seen. I saw a gopher mound the other day that was, I'm pretty sure, 4 times the size of any gopher mound I've ever seen. It looked like the mashed potato mountain from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? It was an impossibly gigantic gopher mound. Now, of course, I can't be certain a gopher produced that, but pretty sure, right? The gophers are going crazy. And the corvids and many other creatures are much more approachable. Something has changed in the fundamental basis. It feels to me as if something has changed in the fundamental basis of the relationships that are ordinarily visible to me in the very limited context of the city in which I live. And I saw a man very slowly relating with a group of ravens. And because he was going so slow and they were at peace, they didn't have to constantly check whether he or something else was a threat. They could do that checking much more slowly. And because they could do that checking more slowly, their metabolisms changed. It's very clear. If you don't have to check for threats every 3 or 4 seconds, you can devote energy to other things. And when I see people walking around in the street, in my, around my house and such, because some of our streets are closed off, there's a very similar thing going on. They're walking in the street, but they don't have to check for threats every half second or so. And so the fundamental nature of their bodies and relationships and the rhythms and the paces and the purposes and the priorities, these are changing. Yeah? They're undergoing sudden, unexpected transformation. And whenever something like that happens, it's a time of both opportunity and danger. There are there are threats on the horizon and directly in our sort of awareness, the virus and so on, and people's reactions to it, and the infodemic, and all of these rather new, although really they're new instances of old threats, and they're combined in kind of a new way. These threats have been with us for a long, long time. The counterfeiting of value, the counterfeiting of authorization, the counterfeiting of power, the counterfeiting of intelligence, the counterfeiting of the purposes for which we come together, the counterfeiting of rewards, the counterfeiting of our dreams, the counterfeiting of our nobility. There's a vast game of mimicry afoot, and it's not new, but its current recipe is, oh wow. Its current recipe is novel. The way the elements have been combined and the likely consequences of that novelty are still quite unpredictable. And people, I think many people, depending on their purpose and their interest, why they're in the game, are learning. But they're also frightened and troubled and disoriented and confused because the fictions upon which our narratives about value and identity and threat and opportunity have had a gaping hole ripped through them. And we can't exactly understand what's on the other side of that hole yet. And everybody's scrambling to be the first one on the scene. But very, very few people are capable of approaching that scene. Because they're using methods that are self-deceiving and outdated. But I see the storm, right, of relatively disoriented confusion around the what's going on, which really is that game of going from the cloud of all possibilities down, to collapse that in 2 dimensions, to get down one step from the top and get down to categories and get down to instances and finally say, well, it's a power grab, Well, it's a conspiracy. Well, it's a virus. And none of those are even close to what's actually happening. And in fact, we're going to need a lot more nuance and scope and depth and richness, I think, to get anywhere near a dependable perspective. And we should try, I think, in different ways and for different purposes, so that we get the experience of collapsing that cloud into identity from many different perspectives, each one of which reveals errors in those with which we were previously familiar. That's the key thing. That's what learning is. To learn, you make mistakes. It's very uncommon that by getting it right, you learn. Sometimes it happens, but it's very uncommon. And people are busy exchanging blame and accusation and criticizing things and that's entirely natural. Of course, which people is the right question there, and why? Sure, not everybody. Select groups of people, right? For all different kinds of agendas, socio-political, intellectual, egoic, opportunistic. And there's nothing wrong with a little bit of criticism or something like that, but it's almost always better to put something better on the table in front, that becomes an option for everybody, than to yell at something that's already on the table. Though we can occasionally learn how to do that first thing by doing the second thing, particularly if that's part of our goal, right? But I think the urge to criticize is half misconceived, because what we really want isn't necessarily to see what's wrong. We want a better path toward that which is good and valuable and true and actually authentically rewarding and human and intelligent and kind and humane. Something that validates and accomplishes the ache at the core of the dreams of our humanity. That ache we're born with, intrinsic, before culture and language intrude. That's the sky I want to see our people retrieve their wings for. These trees around me are not silent. They are silent only in the domain of language. They are speaking in the dimension of relationships. And that conversation is beautiful, and I trust it. We're in a time of radical transformation, and part of what that means is that all the games we've been playing now have different results. And you could say that the ante has been unexpectedly upped on every single action we engage in. In other words, the degree to which ordinary features of our everyday existence matter has increased geometrically over an incredibly short period of time. Whether you go to the store or take a shower or eat a meal or have a conversation or sleep or dream or work, and how you do that and why you do that and what you make of that, all of these things, the consequences of them have become almost unintelligibly more significant than they were but a very short time ago, 3 months ago, right? And it's very difficult for groups and individuals to understand how to make sense of that. In fact, as I experience it, what's happening isn't a thing, it's waves of a thing, right? It's a cascade of a sort of heartbeat of transformation. And although the pace in one dimension of our experience, say like the living relationships and such, has slowed down, I suspect there are places, there are domains of what's going on in which the pace has radically accelerated. And one of those dimensions is the one I just described, the repercussions of the choices that we make, the repercussions of our speech and purposes in coming together and activity and relationships, our consumption. In that domain, I think the pace has accelerated geometrically and may continue to do so. And so it is as if momentum in one dimension of our existence, which is the dimension of sort of physical activity and commercial activity and economic activity, that pace has slowed down dramatically precisely because the pace in another dimension has accelerated and stolen its momentum, so to speak. But one thing that I understand just very directly in my own life and experience is that the choices that I make, the decisions, the behaviors I engage in, the purposes for which I engage in them, have become far more meaningful and far less casual than I am used to. Now, some of us have experienced personal crises in our lives so that we have experience of this kind of rarefied atmosphere. Yeah? Some of us have experienced catastrophic losses or health problems or poverty that absolutely transformed the landscape of our common experience and how we evaluate it and where we place value, why we do so. And so we are not entirely unfamiliar with this, but at no time in my life has there ever been such a sudden and radical transformation in so many simultaneous domains as the one we're experiencing together now. And it's very dangerous because, in my view, the predatory aspects of our fictional supercultures and corporations and so on and so forth, they are well poised to take advantage of this situation, and the common people are very poorly equipped and extremely vulnerable until such time as they form intimate social purposive, intimately linked small social groups oriented around purposes that both protect them and lift them out of that field of vulnerability somehow. And this is a fundamental aspect of the character of the kind of animal we are. But over the past few thousand years, we've been furiously producing supergroups, and they are easily misguided and disoriented, and can be relatively easily taken advantage of by small numbers of highly motivated persons or groups. So this is an Achilles heel for our species. I am hopeful, at least modestly hopeful, that we will learn in this crisis to form the kind of intelligently oriented, skillful, perceptive, small group unities that might offer us some degree of not merely protection, but meaningful, purposive identity together in the situations that we are facing now and are sure to continue to arise and surprise us in the near-term future. But the ante has been upped. Now the choices we make matter more than they ever have. And the repercussions of mistakes in this time can be extremely severe. I think will commonly be extremely severe, in the same way that the repercussions of successful, intelligent behavior will pay off in 7 ways, whereas they ordinarily only pay off in 2. Right? So we desperately need, I think, the motivation to organize together into small, meaningfully and purposed, tightly knit social groups capable of navigating uncertainty beautifully and effectively together. A game B, as Daniel Schmachtenberger might say. And by the way, I strongly recommend you. There are very few people who I would point out and say, please listen to this person. Not for any particular reason, other than I rarely encounter them these days. And that's partly my own, the result of my own isolation. But this guy, Daniel Schmachtenberger, he's someone whose views I profoundly resonate with And he's kind of on the same page and has done a lot of the analytical groundwork to support these perspectives rationally and to debate their value and effectiveness successfully, to defend them. But I don't think they need a lot of defense. We need a plan B right away. We needed it 50 years ago. Earlier I saw a lone robin. It had gotten hold of a really sizable earthworm, the kind we fishermen refer to as night crawlers, though I don't fish anymore because I don't want to hurt the fish. And I regret the fish I hurt. And that may seem hypocritical or conflicted. It's okay. Being human is a lot more nuanced than language and argument can contain. And I'm certainly willing to explore that nuance. But I saw this robin, and it had gotten a hold of a really sizable earthworm, sizable enough that it represented a significant challenge to the robin. And it got it out of the ground. And I don't know if you've ever handled an earthworm, but especially a large one, but they're very peculiar in that they have this snake-like quality of pulsing, coiling musculature that can make them uncommonly difficult to get a grip on, or maintain a grip on. And I'm reminded by that of the circumstances we find ourselves within together right now. But the robin got this worm out of the ground, and it was, alone. And once it succeeded at extracting the worm from the earth, it acted almost surprised. Right? It was as if, and I'm reading human emotions into the situation. Yes, it's true. But it was as if the earthworm was staggered by its own accomplishment. Huh? It was like, wow, that thing's just too big to even, is it really that big? Can I handle this? And it sort of jumped out of the way for a moment, and it did a threat detection run, right? Just like if you were a lighthouse and you were, scanning for threats. And of course it was aware of my presence and that I could see it and was relatively nearby. And then it began to work with the problem of the fact that it had extracted this worm. And it picked it up and sort of threw it a little bit and jumped back and checked things out and pecked at it and sort of tore a piece off, and it began to break the worm up into smaller fragments. And those of us who like to solve problems are very familiar with with the analog or the metalog of that process, right? If you want to solve a big problem, break it down into manageable chunks, go at them one at a time until you sort of get, a complex grasp on the problem, and you can find an angle or a path, right, that leads you into a relationship with the problem where you can manipulate the elements successfully enough to solve subsets, right? And eventually the subsets tend to lead you toward they lead you toward the position where perceptually you decide that the problem has been completely solved. The reason I'm smiling is I'm not sure any problem is ever completely solved, but I understand that feeling, right? Like if it's a technical problem with language or a computer or some process, right? We can solve it so that the bigger problem of like the fact that there are computers or things like this, we're not really, that's outside the scope of what we're trying to resolve. So we can leave that alone and just say like, oh, well, the computer was crashing. I found out why. I replaced this component of the operating system, and now the computer is functioning properly. Problem solved. In any case, it was viscerally fascinating to watch the robin wrestle with the problem of its meal and resolve it piece by piece. And eventually, when it had sort of broken the worm into enough parts and consumed many of those, it picked up the few it had not consumed and the remaining segment of the worm, looked around briefly, did a threat scan. Well, that's my way of describing its behavior. That's not the only thing that was going on by a long shot. And flew to a nearby branch, up out of the reach of potential predators like me. It would be amazing if our species could accomplish something similar with language, because that worm has been dominating us. That worm we somehow pulled out of the ground has been dominating and strangling our people and the biosphere. It leads to knowledge, which leads to machines, which lead to technology, which radically alters whatever we might be referring to with the word evolution in a way that so far has not been good, in my evaluation. Perhaps one day we too will break that problem into manageable parts, make good use of those we can divide, resolve them, and achieve escape velocity. Enter the next order of our relationship with the astonishing possibilities of our kind of intelligence, of abstraction itself, of our humanity, of our role with and for nature and each other. It's not a pipe dream. We can get there. Maybe soon. And if we are to survive and have meaningful existences, I think we have to. Time won't tell. Our choices will. Thanks for joining me. More soon, I hope. Bye-bye for now.